What if I told you that retirement was supposed to be the end of my detective days, but instead, it became the beginning of the most bizarre case I'd ever encounter? I'm Detective Frank Morrison, and after 45 years on the force, I thought I'd seen everything. Boy, was I wrong. It was a Tuesday morning in April, 3 months into my retirement. I was sitting on my porch in Millbrook, a quiet suburb where the most excitement usually comes from Mrs. Henderson's cat getting stuck in her oak tree. I had my coffee, my newspaper, and absolutely nothing to do. That's when I heard the screaming. Now you'd think, after decades of responding to emergency calls, I'd be tired of running toward trouble. But old habits die hard. I bolted from my chair, spilling coffee all over my favorite flannel shirt, and ran toward the sound. It was coming from the new neighbor's house, the one that had been empty for months before someone finally moved in last week. As I approached the 2-story colonial, I could see a woman in her 30s standing in the front yard, pointing at her second-floor window. She was pale as a ghost and shaking like a leaf. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a man standing at that window, perfectly still, staring down at us. But here's the thing that didn't make sense. This woman was supposed to be living alone. I introduced myself, showed her my retired badge, and asked what was happening. Her name was Sarah Chen, and she'd just moved from California to start fresh after a messy divorce. She insisted that there was no one else in the house, that she'd been alone since moving in, and that she had no idea who that man was, or how he'd gotten inside. The logical part of my brain, the part trained by decades of police work, told me this was probably a break-in. Simple, straightforward. Call it in to the active duty cops and let them handle it. But something felt off. The man at the window wasn't moving. He wasn't looking around nervously like most burglars would. He was just standing there, perfectly still, like a statue. I called 911 and then made a decision that would change everything. I told Sarah to stay outside and keep her distance, and I went in to investigate myself. I know what you're thinking, Frank. You're retired. This isn't your job anymore. But 45 years of instinct don't just disappear because you get a gold watch and a pension. The house was completely silent as I entered through the unlocked front door. My heart was pounding, but my training kicked in. I moved carefully through the first floor, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding spot. Nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there except Sarah. As I climbed the stairs, each step creaking under my weight, I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. This was the feeling I'd missed more than I cared to admit. The uncertainty, the mystery, the hunt for answers. At the top of the stairs, I could see into the bedroom where we'd spotted the figure. It was empty. I searched every room on the second floor twice. Under beds, in closets, behind curtains, even in the bathroom shower. There was absolutely no one there. But here's where it gets really strange. As I was checking the master bedroom one more time, I noticed something that made my detective instincts go haywire. On the nightstand next to the bed was a glass of water. Not unusual, right? Except this glass was half empty, and there was a perfect ring of condensation around its base on the wooden surface. That glass had been sitting there for maybe 10, 15 minutes maximum. Someone had been drinking from it recently. I called out, announced myself as police, demanded that whoever was in the house show themselves. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. But then I heard something that made my skin crawl. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from directly above me. The problem was, I was on the second floor. There was no third floor. I ran outside to check the roof line. Sure enough, the house was only 2 stories. No attic access, no third floor, nowhere for someone to be walking around above that bedroom. But I had heard those footsteps as clearly as I'm speaking to you now. When the patrol officers arrived, they searched the house from top to bottom. They found exactly what I had found. Nothing. No evidence of an intruder, no signs of forced entry, no explanation for what Sarah and I had seen. The responding officers were professional but skeptical. One of them even suggested that maybe the stress of moving and the divorce had Sarah seeing things. But I knew what I'd seen, and more importantly, I knew what I'd heard. Those footsteps weren't my imagination. That glass of water wasn't a figment of my stress. Something was happening in that house, and I was going to figure out what it was. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the case, running through every detail, every possibility. In all my years as a detective, I'd learned that when something doesn't make sense, it's usually because you're missing a crucial piece of information. So I decided to do what I'd always done, investigate. The next morning, I went to the county records office. I pulled up everything I could find about that house. Built in 1987, owned by the same family for 30 years until they sold it 6 months ago. The previous owners, the Hartwell family, had lived there without incident until Robert Hartwell died suddenly of a heart attack in that very bedroom where I'd found the glass of water. His wife, Margaret, had moved out within a week of his death. She couldn't bear to stay in the house where her husband had died. When I tracked down Margaret's new address and called her, she was hesitant to talk at first. But when I mentioned the man at the window, she went silent for a long moment. Then she told me something that changed everything. Robert had a habit of standing at that bedroom window every morning while he drank his coffee. He'd watch the neighborhood wake up, observe the daily routines of his neighbors. It was his quiet time, his moment of peace before starting each day. And every night he'd have a glass of water on his nightstand, always drinking exactly half before going to sleep. Margaret also mentioned something else. In the days following Robert's death, before she moved out, she'd sworn she could hear him walking around upstairs. She'd dismissed it as grief, as her mind playing tricks on her. But now, hearing about Sarah's experience, she wasn't so sure. I thanked Margaret for her time and hung up, my mind racing. As a detective, I'd always been a facts and evidence kind of guy. Logical explanations, rational conclusions. But this case was challenging everything I thought I knew about the world. I decided to stake out the house. I parked across the street at dawn and waited. Sarah had given me permission to keep an eye on the place, and frankly, I think she was relieved to have someone who believed her story. At exactly 6:47 a.m., I saw him, the figure at the window, clear as day, standing there looking out at the neighborhood just like Margaret had described. I grabbed my binoculars and focused on the window. The man was middle-aged, average height, wearing what looked like a blue robe. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. I could see right through him. Not completely, but enough to make out the wall behind him. It was like looking at a double-exposed photograph. I watched for exactly 12 minutes. Then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he was gone. I immediately called Sarah and asked her to meet me at the house. When she arrived, we went upstairs together. The glass of water was on the nightstand, half empty, with fresh condensation around its base. Sarah looked at me with a mixture of fear and vindication. She'd been seeing this every morning since she moved in, but she'd been too afraid to tell anyone the full truth. She thought people would think she was crazy. Hell, if someone had told me this story 3 months ago, I might have thought they were crazy too. But here's what 45 years of detective work had taught me. When you eliminate all the logical explanations and you're left with something impossible, maybe it's time to expand your definition of possible. I'd spent my entire career dealing with the darker side of human nature, with crimes that defied explanation, with cases that challenged everything I thought I knew about people. This was just another mystery to solve. I convinced Sarah to let me spend a few nights in the house, to document everything that happened. She was hesitant at first, but I think she was also relieved to have someone who believed her, someone who was willing to help her figure out what was going on. The first night was quiet, too quiet. I sat up in the living room with a clear view of the stairs, notebook in hand, ready to document anything unusual. At 3:17 a.m., I heard the footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, coming from directly above me. I crept upstairs, but the moment I reached the second floor, the sound stopped. The second night was when things got really interesting. I was dozing in the chair when I heard something that made me sit up straight. It was the sound of running water coming from the kitchen. I made my way downstairs and found the kitchen faucet running at full blast. When I turned it off, I noticed something that made my detective instincts kick into high gear. There were 2 glasses on the counter. One was the glass I'd been drinking from earlier. The other was identical, but it was half full of water still cold from the tap. Someone or something had filled that glass while I was upstairs, but I was alone in the house. On the 3rd night, I finally got my answer. I was sitting in the living room, wide awake, when I heard footsteps on the stairs. But this time, instead of running upstairs, I stayed put and watched. That's when I saw him. Robert Hartwell descended the stairs slowly, wearing the same blue robe I'd seen at the window. He moved with the careful, deliberate steps of someone who'd walked those stairs thousands of times. He didn't seem to notice me at first, just continued his apparent routine, walking to the kitchen, filling a glass with water, and then heading back upstairs. As he passed by my chair, he paused. For a moment, our eyes met. He looked confused, as if he was trying to remember something important. Then, without a word, he continued upstairs. I heard him moving around in the bedroom, heard the distinctive sound of a glass being set down on the nightstand. I sat there for the rest of the night, trying to process what I'd witnessed. As dawn broke, I went upstairs to check the bedroom. The glass was there, half empty, just as it had been every morning. But there was something else. On the dresser, there was a small framed photograph that hadn't been there before. It was a picture of Robert and Margaret, taken on their wedding day 35 years ago. That's when I realized what was happening. Robert wasn't haunting the house in the traditional sense. He was simply continuing his routine, following the patterns he'd established over 30 years of living there. He got up every morning, stood at the window, went downstairs for water, and went back to bed. Death hadn't changed his habits. It had just made him invisible to most people. But why could Sarah and I see him? I think it was because we were both in transition. Sarah was starting a new life, trying to establish new routines in a house where someone else's routines were still playing out. I was adjusting to retirement, to the absence of the routine that had defined my life for 45 years. Maybe people in transition are more sensitive to the routines of others, even those who are no longer technically alive. I shared my theory with Sarah, and together we came up with a plan. If Robert was simply following his old routine, maybe we could help him understand that it was time to move on. We waited until the next morning, and when he appeared at the window, Sarah spoke to him directly. She told him that Margaret was safe, that she'd moved on and was living happily in a new place. She thanked him for taking care of the house all these years, but explained that it was time for him to rest. At first, there was no response. But then, slowly, Robert turned from the window and looked directly at Sarah. For just a moment, I saw recognition in his eyes, understanding. He nodded once, a small, sad smile crossing his face. Then he simply faded away, like morning mist disappearing in the sunlight. That was 6 months ago. Sarah still lives in the house, and she's never seen Robert again. The morning routine has stopped. The mysterious glasses of water no longer appear, and the footsteps have fallen silent. The house has finally let go of its previous owner, and he's found peace. As for me, well, this case taught me that retirement doesn't mean the end of mystery and discovery. It just means approaching them with a different perspective. I've started volunteering with a local paranormal research group, applying my detective skills to cases that most people would dismiss as impossible. Because here's what I've learned in my 70 years on this earth, and especially in my 45 years as a detective. The world is far more complex and mysterious than we give it credit for. Sometimes the most logical explanation is that there is no logical explanation. Sometimes the evidence points to something beyond our normal understanding of reality. And sometimes the most important thing a detective can do is simply believe the witness, even when their story seems impossible. That's the case that convinced me that retirement might be the end of my police career, but it's certainly not the end of my detective work. If anything, it's given me the freedom to investigate the cases that really matter, the ones that challenge everything we think we know about the world around us. So the next time someone tells you they've seen something impossible, don't dismiss them. Listen carefully, investigate thoroughly, and remember that sometimes the most extraordinary cases require us to expand our definition of what's possible. Because in my experience, the impossible happens more often than we'd like to admit. And who knows? Maybe your retirement will be just as interesting as mine has been.